Today, we're joined by a very special guest. She's a fellow podcaster and a perfectionist coach. It's an absolute honor to welcome Sam Laura Brown. Hi, Sam. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Thank you for coming on. What you do. I have a lot of people in my life that are perfectionists. I totally am not. I wish I was in a sense, but we have a lot of questions.
Amazing.
Yeah. So let's start with a little bit about your background and how did you get into this particular field?
Yeah, well, I started my business as a blog in 2013. At the time, I didn't know I was a perfectionist. I had an understanding of perfectionism that most people do, which is perfectionists are just those super organized people that manage to do everything perfectly. So I didn't realize that that was a mindset that I was in, even though throughout university, like I have a law degree and a finance degree, throughout that whole schooling journey, a lot of perfectionism was going on for me, but I was doing really well. And so it wasn't a problem. But once I started my business and I was just chatting about personal development stuff, that I found that I was really getting in my own way, that I felt like I had a motivation problem. That's how it kind of manifested to do the things that I know I needed to do. And I would post on my blog and then I'd edit it after it was posted. Another big thing that was really kind of an alarm bell to me that there was something going on was that I didn't want to tell anyone in my life about my blog. I felt so embarrassed about it that who did I think I was to have an opinion about things, and that especially personal development related, like I just found that world and I really just felt like I couldn't share that with other people. And it also felt like that blog and what I was talking about felt so true to myself, more so than anything I'd done study-wise or anything like that. So to fail at that felt like a much more painful thing than failing at being an accountant or anything like that. So that's when I really started to realize that there was something going on mindset wise. And through the work of Brene Brown, for example, also Dr. Carol Dweck, and learning about what perfectionism really is, and then beginning to talk about that as I was going through that journey and recognizing so many people are perfectionists and are getting in their own way and they don't even realize that it's perfectionism, and that there are things you can do to get out of that mindset and into a growth mindset. That as I started to share that journey and began coaching and helping others with that now I am, I guess, pretty much a decade into really my journey with perfectionism and spending a lot of that time sharing that journey. But I definitely didn't get into business even recognizing I was a perfectionist. So it's really evolved over the years.
You mentioned that you didn't even really, or you, and I'm sure a lot of people, when they're on that journey, they didn't even realize what perfectionism is, or that they are turning into perfectionists, right? So how do you, as a perfectionist coach, how do you define perfectionism? What is it?
Yeah, I often mention, I love Brene Brown, shame and vulnerability researcher. A lot of people are familiar with her now after her incredible TED Talks. But her definition is something that really helped piece things together for me, that shame. So her quote is that perfectionism is really the belief that if I just look perfect and do everything perfectly, I can avoid shame, judgment, and blame. So really perfectionism is a strategy to avoid shame, and perfectionists aren't perfect people. Perfectionists are people who are ashamed they're not perfect. And we can go into the 5 signs of perfectionism and what that looks like. But for the most part, perfectionism tends to manifest as inaction. And it's more about doing, instead of, people think perfectionism is you do everything perfectly. A lot of times it's actually about avoiding doing anything imperfectly. Hence, a lot of perfectionists procrastinate. They feel very overwhelmed. They leave things until the last minute. There's a lot of that going on because it's so vulnerable. It feels so vulnerable to give things a full effort, because if you give something a full effort and it's not good enough, then we'd make that mean something about ourselves. So instead of giving a full effort, we leave things until the last minute. We're overwhelmed. We burn ourselves out, like all these different things, so that we can always say, well, I would have done better if I didn't leave it to the last minute. So that is a really important piece of perfectionism. And for some perfectionists, it does manifest as being overprepared and all of those things. And for me, I have my times when I'm overprepared and that kind of thing. But a lot of times it's more like this half-assing and like maybe having really vague goals, or like, you know, I'm just going to go with the flow. It's so important to not think like, oh, well, I identify with being a perfectionist and I don't have like this big kind of traumatic event. But a lot of times it can be like a comment from a teacher, or like anything that our brain, especially as children, interprets as like thinking that we're inadequate. And then we decide like, I never want to feel this way again. And the best way to avoid that is if I just do everything perfectly and avoid imperfection. And then like that works in childhood. Like we need others to help us survive. And then we just kind of bring that mindset into adulthood because we don't actually realize it's going on. And so what I really help people with is recognizing that mindset, really knowing like perfectionism isn't toxic. Like it's so important. I think this is such an important piece of it, that it's not this thing you have to like overcome or like this evil toxic thing. It's just a mindset. It's a set of beliefs. It served you at one point in time, and now in a lot of ways it's not. And so let's just work on getting into the growth mindset. But if we think that perfectionism is toxic or is like the enemy, then it's so hard to let go of it. And it's like a lot of people have this idea that, well, if my parents had been different or the teachers had been different, then I wouldn't have been triggered into this trauma that's made me a perfectionist, because then we're kind of at the effect. It's like, oh, my brain just had a very human response to the situation I was in, and it decided on a survival strategy that did effectively work at the time. And now it's not working for me now that I'm an adult and I can really take care of myself. And so that's the way I like to think about it, because then it can really become blaming others instead of really taking ownership for like, that's not to say that others haven't been at fault or that they, you know, did wrong by us. But if we want to change, then it's really important to like recognize perfectionism. If I'm exhibiting those perfectionist tendencies today and getting my own way, it's because of the thoughts I'm having today, not the thoughts I had as an 11-year-old. And it might be that those thoughts I had as an 11-year-old are very familiar. My brain is very skilled at thinking those thoughts and thinks them on default, but it's the thoughts I'm having today. And we can change those thoughts, and you don't have to change all your thoughts. Obviously, we think a lot of thoughts all the time. Most of them are subconscious, but it's really about understanding that we can just change a couple of thoughts and we can be showing up differently and having a different relationship with ourselves.
And I'd love for you to get into like the 5 stages that you mentioned earlier. But before that, I did have a question on how do you decide like the difference between perfectionism and just that feeling of wanting to give something your best effort? And I think parenting is a perfect example that you obviously want to do your best, want to try to be the best parent you can, right? But at the same time, so how do you know the difference that, wait a minute, now I'm being a perfectionist. This is not possible. I should kind of stop right there. So what's the difference, and where's that line cross?
Yeah, it's really about less so the actions and more so what's fueling it. So when it's being fueled by inadequacy or like thinking, like a lot of us will experience it as like feeling like we need to control things. That is when it's that perfectionist tendencies, and it doesn't result in the best outcome for anyone involved. But often the actions can look the same as when someone is in the growth mindset, which is a term I've mentioned a few times, and we can go into what that is. I think it's really important. But when we're being growth minded about something, that doesn't just mean, you know, I'm growth minded because I love personal development books. I originally thought that when I first heard about it. It's really when you are growth minded, you are willing to practice and to, like, you see, for example, with parenting, you see it as a skill. And I work with entrepreneurs, like you see business as a skill rather than something that you should naturally be able to do perfectly from day one. So when you can see parenting as a skill and be like leaned in this really curious, inquisitive, vulnerable, open, courageous way, that's when we are actually going to have the best outcomes for everyone involved. But when we're being a perfectionist about it, it's when we are taking actions, and they might be the same actions, it might look the same from the outside, but when we're doing that from a place of inadequacy and our own insecurities that we have, and trying to control and like over-prepared or like leaving things until the last minute and that kind of thing, that is when we're actually not able to do the best job that we can. Because as well, then it's like, you know, if something happens with the child, then we make that mean something about us, and it becomes like this whole thing. it doesn't result in the best outcomes. And I think for a lot of perfectionists, a big part of learning to, like I refer to it as your perfectionism handbrake, learning to release that is really recognizing that the success that you've had is despite the perfectionism, not because of it, because a lot of times we associate those perfectionist tendencies. Like a lot of perfectionists are very successful, and particularly around schooling and that kind of thing, that you can leave things until the last minute and get the A+. And so it's recognizing not that there's something wrong with being a perfectionist, as I mentioned, and like we need to fix it, but it's also like not giving credit to the perfectionism, because it actually isn't that has helped you achieve what you have, or you would have been able to achieve more without being in that perfectionist mindset. And so it's really about being in the growth mindset. And that's when we are ambitiously pursuing the goals that we have without doing it at our own expense, without doing it from a place of insecurity, and without pressure and stress.
Do get into that, the growth mindset, and tips and, advice that you give to your clients and on your podcast.
Sure. Yeah. So my podcast, The Perfectionism Project, I won't have time to go into a lot of detail in this interview, but just to quickly touch as well on the 5 signs of perfectionism is overwhelm, procrastination, burnout, fear of judgment, all or nothing thinking. So those are all ways, like all strategies that we have to avoid giving a full effort and therefore avoid feeling shame. And the irony of it all is that perfectionists really shame themselves a lot. And it's like a really big part of getting into that growth mindset. Along that journey, you learn how to actually be compassionate with yourself in a way that helps you achieve more, not less. Because as you mentioned with that question before, we often think like, well, if I'm being kind to myself, like, how do I balance that with like, I actually want to achieve things? And I help entrepreneurs with perfectionism. And so a lot of times in business, it's really like, but like, I have these big goals and like, how do I actually do that? And so it's really about having a relationship with yourself where you're able to be more productive as a result of that, not less productive. It's not like kindness and low levels of productivity and then like beat yourself up and high levels of productivity. It's actually when we're beating ourselves up that we're letting ourselves off the hook, and often like spending so much time in all this drama about how inadequate we are that we're like, you might have a long to-do list and then you don't even know where to start when the time comes and you just procrastinate. So we can go into the growth mindset. Yeah. When did you realize you were a perfectionist? I mentioned at the beginning when I was starting my blog, and for me, it manifested as like, I just thought I had this big motivation problem that I wish I could like just stay motivated. And I was trying to solve for a motivation problem and I got nowhere with that because it wasn't a motivation problem. And while like when we're in that perfectionist mindset, it can manifest as like we're doing things that look like we're not motivated, like being inconsistent and stopping and starting, that like all or nothing mindset. But it was really when I noticed through the business, and business is such a powerful tool for personal development, that I noticed like, oh, I'm really getting in my own way. Like I know what I need to do and I'm just not doing it. And I've been able to achieve a lot in school. And like, why am I struggling now with business to actually put myself out there and confidently talk about what I'm doing? And then I was learning through like Brené Brown, and I mentioned Dr. Carol Dweck, who talks about the growth mindset. Like I really started to piece together what perfectionism actually is. And that's why I'm so passionate to talk about it, because there's so much around perfectionism that's like, just remember, nobody's perfect. And it's like, yeah, I know. And I still find myself like wanting to perfect things or avoid imperfections. So like, what do I actually do about it? Like all those little mantras, they sound nice, but so much is still to this day about perfectionism is like, just remember, perfection isn't a thing. Fuck perfectionism and like, fuck things being perfect. It's like, yeah, I get it intellectually. And it's like, it's very overbearing to be thinking that way, but like, what are the practical things that I actually do to be able to show up fully without needing to overthink and second guess everything? So that's really where the growth mindset comes into things. And so the growth mindset, and this is from Dr. Carol Dweck, that she talks about the growth mindset and the perfectionist there and the fixed mindset. When we're in the growth mindset, we really see our talents, our abilities, our intelligence as being able to be improved upon with effort and practice. So when we're in the growth mindset, we actually live by that mantra that it's better to have tried and failed than to have never tried at all. When we're in the perfectionist mindset, we understand that. Like you hear people talking about, for example, with business, you know, a successful business is built on a pile of failures. And yet we try so hard to avoid failure. And often we avoid failure by not even trying. And we live by that mantra that it's better to not try than it is to fail. And often that manifests as like waiting for the perfect time, needing to have all of your ducks in a row, and all of that kind of thing that are just excuses not to start so that we don't fail and feel the shame of failing. It's not fear of failure. I think as well with perfectionism, people talk about, oh, it's fear of failure or fear of judgment. And I thought that for a while. And it's actually fear of shame, which are the feelings that we would feel if we were a failure and if we were rejected, and also for a success, because a lot of times we're scared of being successful because we might be rejected from our inner circle, or from the community at large if we're too successful. And so it's really recognizing that when we are in that perfectionist mindset, that is when we're believing that effort is a sign of inadequacy. Like, this is when we're in the mindset of like, I don't want to waste any effort on the wrong thing. So I'm just going to do the smart thing and figure out the best idea from the beginning and implement that. And we see that our talents, our abilities, our intelligence, that they are fixed and like can be improved upon a bit. But for the most part, they are what we naturally are gifted with. And therefore, everything we do, we see it as evidence of whether or not we're good enough. And for example, with schooling, this looks like doing the subjects where you know you're going to get the A instead of doing the one you really want to do where you might not actually do well. So when we're getting to the growth mindset, I can go into the practical steps to do that. But it's really important to recognize, like, we're not trying to not be a perfectionist because like that doesn't work. It's about working on getting to the growth mindset. And there's a spectrum. So a lot of perfectionists are already very growth minded, maybe in a hobby, maybe in relationships where you really believe like relationships are something that need to be developed. And like, it's not this natural thing. Like, you have to actually work at a relationship. Like, we all have areas where we're growth minded, and the people I help, they were praised for being smart and intelligent in school and that kind of thing. And there have been studies that show you can frame things in a certain way to put someone more towards the perfectionist end of the spectrum than the growth mindset end. And so what I help people with is like framing their life and their business and using particularly planning to do that, so that it's easier to be growth minded, and you can also see where you're not being growth minded and do that work.
Wow.
Yeah, you mentioned like some of the practical stuff, and that's something that we on this podcast we try to focus on a lot, because it's like you said, and I love that you brought this point up, is there's so many quotes from experts and so many which are nice to hear, and I'm not saying they're bad. They are nice quotes to hear from motivational speakers and things like that, but I always feel that more often than not we always lose out on the practical side of that. Okay, that's sure, it's positive, it's good to hear positive things, but now what do we do with it?
Exactly.
Or how do we implement it? Right. So I love you mentioned that, and can you get into that, like a little few of the practical things and how to get started on that journey of not letting perfectionism get in your way?
Yeah. So for anyone who's interested in this, I really recommend going to listen to my podcast, because I have a lot of helpful episodes that really dive into practical stuff. Yes. Yeah. But I'll just cover really the main steps that I have my clients that I personally am implementing these. And it's really, so when it comes to the growth mindset, there are different things that we can do to help with that. Things like process praise, where we are really encouraging ourselves, like, for the effort that we're putting in and being courageous, instead of like, oh, did you get the A or not? Did you make the money or not? Like, we often think in this, like, well, it was worth it if I got the end result, and if I didn't get the result, then it was a waste of effort. So things like process praise. But what I found is that, like, it's nice to know those different ideas, but to really have a process for embodying that, and particularly with business, it's, as I mentioned, like, for a lot of perfectionists, you can do well in school and all of that, but it's when you're doing your own thing and you're the boss, and also it feels like you're doing something that really feels like you and true to you, that it brings up those perfectionist tendencies. And so the process that my clients go through and that I teach in my program, and I also teach on the podcast as well, is to plan properly as a perfectionist, follow through 80% of the time, rest without guilt. So I call that clean rest, and to repeat that. And when we are doing that, that gets us into the growth mindset just by the nature of doing those things. And also we're able to then see when our perfectionism handbrake is on and do the work that we need to release that. A lot of perfectionists, we love to-do lists and the long to-do list. And that really has us actually being like, it sets us up to be in the perfectionist mindset, and it gets our perfectionist mindset working against us instead of for us. So when you're able to actually plan properly, and that looks like planning from your calendar in a specific way, and I can go through a bit about what that looks like. And again, for anyone who's interested, go and listen to my podcast because I go into it there. But you can really set yourself up to be in a growth mindset and then easily notice when you're not in it. I call it power planning, and there are 3 steps when you're planning properly. So you also have a growth goal. I won't go into that, but that's a goal. And as I mentioned, I help entrepreneurs. So we have a revenue goal that's set above what we believe is possible. It's not that it's impossible, but our brain, because of the perfectionism and thinking that we're inadequate, our brain thinks like, well, others could do that, but not me. And there's so many reasons for setting goals that way. As I mentioned, a lot of times perfectionists are like, well, I'm so stressed when I have a goal with a deadline. So my growth is just to not have the goal and to let it go. And really, that's kind of just the same thing, is like we're perpetuating this mentality that like, I need to be able to get to that goal and that deadline. And if I can't, then it's a waste of effort. So instead we have this growth goal, and then we use power planning and clean rest to pursue it. So with that, there are 3 steps. So it's your power hour, little tweaks, and your weekly review. So in your power hour, I use iCal. Other people in my program, which is called Perfectionist Getting Shit Done, use Google Calendar, but one of the 2. And also I want to mention, this isn't time blocking, because a lot of perfectionists are like, I've tried the calendar thing, I just fell behind. It was so stressful. It's just because you're actually following planning advice that doesn't work for a perfectionist. It's not the calendar. So what we do is we identify our needle movers based on our goal that we have. So those are the things that will actually move the business forward. And when it comes to that as well, it's really important to know that having the goal helps us figure out what's important and what's not. A lot of times we're like, I don't have this goal, it's too stressful, or we have like 20 goals. And so it's really hard to figure out what's important and what isn't. And then we can't trust ourselves to actually be doing what matters in the time we have to get work done. And so we feel like we need more time because we can't trust ourselves that we're using our time wisely. Whereas what I teach is really the opposite of that in a lot of ways. So we identify our needle movers, we put them in the calendar. And what a really important distinction here is, when you're putting them in your calendar, you are first scheduling your commitments that you have. So like stuff with your family, workouts, whatever. Then you're scheduling clean rest. This is time. So if you have a business, this is time when you're not allowed to work on your business. If you are studying, this is time when you're not allowed to study. Like, this is time that you're not allowed. Like, perfectionists want to be productive 24/7, but when we try to be productive 24/7, we feel guilty and then we just waste time. So instead, you first of all schedule, this is the time that I'm not allowed to work on my business in my case. And that doesn't mean that I won't do like productive things in that time, or that guilt won't sometimes come into it, but it's about that rest being as clean as possible. And then it means that after you schedule that, then you schedule in the remaining time your needle moving tasks. So for me, that's business tasks. And instead of what we often do is like, okay, I have this long to-do list. If I'm working from a calendar, I'm going to take that long to-do list and try and like shove it in there. I'm going to start my day at 5 a.m., finish at 10 p.m., no lunch break, everything. We're like estimating about half the time that's really needed. And it doesn't work. And it's just because the planning advice that kind of way doesn't work for a perfectionist. So it's really knowing that if you have that clean rest, and then you, instead of like resting in the time that's left over, and for anyone who is like, you know, I just love what I do, and, or I just like, I love feeling like everything's done and I rest better when everything's done. The reason you're not getting everything done and resting is because you're not resting. And so it's really important to have that rest go in first, and then have the needle movers. And then the final step in that hour where you're planning out your week is to commit. And we look at like workability and contingency plans. And like a lot of times we just get the calendar and we're like, that looks pretty. Okay, off to do my week. And it's really like, no, actually, like, let's mentally zoom into like Thursday. If today was Thursday and that was on my plate, how would I feel? Oh, I'd feel really overwhelmed because I haven't given myself a lunch break, or I'm like expecting myself that when I get home from somewhere, I'm going to like jump straight into work, to be like actually making those plans. And we have buffer time and things like that, because the second step is little tweaks. So what we do, instead of like, for example, with time blocking, nothing against that, but like when I used to do that, that the calendar was like what it was what it was. And so as I went about the week, I would just fall behind. And then with that all or nothing thinking, I just abandoned the whole thing. So, and then like wait till Monday when I was more motivated. And so it's really about like constantly updating it as you go and using your calendar as your to-do list, and then making those little tweaks. So sometimes things take longer than you allowed for. Sometimes they're quicker. We plan for outcomes rather than activities. So we are actually putting like the result of the time rather than like, work on Instagram strategy or like study this or whatever it is. It's the result of that, so that our brain can actually see there might be a better way to do it or a quicker way. And we're not always having to like be attached to the, like, our brain often wants to do it the complicated way. And so this allows for us during the week to be like, oh, actually, I completely overestimated that, or I could delegate that, or things like that. So make these little tweaks. I like to put a little check mark emoji in my calendar. And like I'm never behind because I'm constantly just updating it and keeping it workable. And if I need to move things into buffer time or until the next week, I can do that. And then it means when I'm doing my weekly review at the end of the week, which is the third step, and this is so important because perfectionists often like, kind of don't want to look at anything because like, I want to actually see that I got nothing done because I feel completely unproductive. And so when we're planning this, we become more productive, but also a huge part of this, and relating this all back to the growth mindset, like all of this helps us to get into a growth mindset, is that praising ourselves for the progress we're making and not just like the end result, especially like business, but pretty much anything that week to week, you're probably not going to feel like a lot of change is happening. It is, but we're not going to really notice it. And our perfectionist brain wants to look at everything we didn't get done. And so instead, like in that weekly review, we objectively look at the week and we can see like, oh, I actually did get stuff done. And also what isn't working, like what do I need to change? And not in this, like, I'm completely inadequate and this whole week was a wash and like, I'm just going to try again, but really being specific about like, oh, actually it didn't work when, I planned to start my day at 5 a.m. and I woke up at 7 a.m. and I started at 8. And actually next week I might just plan to start at 8 a.m. It's like,
do you teach them other skills like CBT and meditation and stuff like that? Before
I don't personally teach CBT or meditation. We do like self-coaching and different things like that. But yeah, and there's a lot of people in my program, clients that I work with, that they have all like, there'll be people who like a lot of my clients also do therapy and like all these different things as well. And so it's really like this is very supportive of all of that and integrates with like other modalities and other practices. It's not like you do this or you're in therapy or you're meditating, or it's like it really compounds it. And as well, like the people that I help do a lot of procrastinating and like love learning things and then find that they're not really implementing what they're learning. And so it's really like having this as well that helps you implement, like for the people I work with, if they've done marketing programs or like personal development programs, instead of just like learning it or like, reading books and then you just kind of, that was inspiring, I'll move on to the next one. That was inspiring, I'll move on to the next one. It's like actually having a process for taking what you're learning and putting it into practice. And going back to your question, like the same with other modalities or other ways to support yourself with your perfectionism and with your mental health as well, that they're really supportive. And yeah, we have a lot of clients in my program who are in therapy and doing other things like that as well.
Well, I think what you teach is fascinating.
Well, yeah. I think so too, because it's important sometimes to have that practical side. Like, we keep coming back to that, but I think it's only because that's so important to know out there that everything is like, a combination of practical and psychological. It's never just one thing. It's a combination of utilizing the best of both, right? Because you need both.
Like I'm such a big believer too. And it's when we're doing the practical that we see the psychological, like that. When we are actually in action, that we're able to witness how our brain is thinking and make those changes. And so that's why it's really focused around it works so well, because it's not like, okay, well, I'm just going to put my life on hold for a year and like figure myself out. It's like actually continuing to show up is one of the best ways. And it's not to say that's always the best case. And obviously there's nuance to that. But a lot of times we want to just like go into hiding for a year and like figure ourselves out and then like reemerge as this like perfect person. And it's instead recognizing that taking action and then having a way to review it. And like, we coach people in my program and, you know, they get support and all of that kind of thing, that you can then say like, oh, this is going on for me. And I have noticed this because of the way I'm approaching my week, and I can actually see myself better and understand myself better. And now I can actually take this to a coaching session, or I can take this to my therapist, or things like that, that when we're just wanting to really focus on just the psychological and just the mindset side, and we're not actually taking action at the same time, it becomes often an intellectual pursuit to improve our mental health, instead of being something that we actually get to experience and live and embody. And so I'm very passionate about, obviously, time and place, and it definitely depends on circumstances, but a lot of times it's so important to continue taking action, to learn how to do that in a way that really actually supports you. You're not like doing that to hustle or using it against yourself, or like beating yourself up and like all of that kind of thing. But the taking action, like for me, the business stuff and trying to take action, that revealed to me what my brain was doing. And if I hadn't been doing those things, I like that mindset would have just gone completely undetected and would still be running my life in so many ways, but I wouldn't have noticed because I wasn't doing the practical stuff. I wasn't doing things, but was just able to kind of sit there dormant. And I could have, you know, I was learning about things intellectually, but it wasn't until I was actually out in the world doing stuff and putting myself out there and trying to give things a full effort that I've really been able to get into that growth mindset. And I'm still on that journey myself, but really make a lot of progress with my perfectionism, just from recognizing like the psychological and the mindset stuff. The best way to work on that is often to be doing the practical stuff, because that's what allows you to see it and therefore do the work on it.
Well, I love that part that you said about beating yourself up, you know, and I love that part because it's true. I mean, you know, you'll sit there and beat yourself up and that does nothing. So when you actually get up and do the work, there you go. Change your mindset, right? Yeah,
like we think that if we just, you know, we beat ourselves up, like, if I just do it a little bit hard, if I'm just a little bit more cruel to myself, maybe I'll be motivated enough to actually do the thing. And I know for me, like, I used to really operate like that. And it felt very scary to think that I could actually have a loving, caring relationship with myself and get more stuff done and like achieve more of my goals. And it just felt like, how could that be true? Because won't I just get complacent and just kind of go with the flow and not actually do anything? And the opposite is true. And I think we can actually see that this is the case when we think about a friend. If they aren't doing stuff that they want to do, we don't beat them up.
Sam,
pardon?
Meet my friend Neil. This is the perfectionist I was talking about.
It's like, I mean, a lot of humans beat themselves up and are very, like, we're often the most critical person of ourselves. And so it's like, and it's a process. I'm not saying I never do that, but it used to just be the way I operated. And now, like, and different things, like, instead of saying I should have, I say next time I will. And it's like just little things like that can really have you keep yourself the most accountable when you're kind to yourself. And as I was saying, like, when it's a friend that if they aren't being productive, we're not like, oh yeah, it's because you're not good enough. And like, just like, often that doesn't work. And like shaming someone into being more productive or like doing the things they want to do doesn't tend to result well. And we can see that so clearly when it's other people. And that's why with others, we're really encouraging and supportive. We're like, oh no, but for myself, I just get lazy and complacent if I did that to myself. And so it's recognizing, like, it's the same psychology as if it's a friend, that when we feel supported, and it doesn't mean sometimes we don't say to a friend, like, come on, let's go, like, get out of the pity party and let's just do the thing. Like, there will definitely be times where when you're supporting your friend the best, that you have a bit of real talk, but it's not with this flavor of shame of like, yeah, because you're not good enough. And like, this was just like, here you go again, the classic you. Like, it's just really recognizing that the way we talk to ourselves has such an impact. And what I teach, it really helps you to develop self-trust and that relationship with yourself, that you can actually feel comfortable being with yourself and not like you're this like slave driver that's basically just trying to get you to be more and more and more and more productive. But that's never good enough because there's always more to do. So it's a huge part of it. And just seeing that, like, when you're beating yourself up, you are letting yourself off the hook. Like, we are then indulging in self-pity, and there's so much drama around that actually, if you want to keep yourself accountable, and you've been saying, I am, harsh on myself because I don't want to let myself off the hook, to recognize it is when you are being compassionate to yourself. And I know for perfectionists, we're like, yeah. But when you are actually talking to yourself, and the cliche thing, as you would a friend, and that doesn't feel weird, like you practice that enough that your brain just starts to default to actually supporting yourself. It's such a different way to live. And it's like night and day, but it's really important to just recognize that when we're beating ourselves up, we are letting ourselves off the hook. That's one of the ways that we avoid putting in a full effort. So that if you want to keep yourself accountable, the best way to do that is to, yes, give yourself real talk and all of that, but not without the shame without the shame and without the pity party.
I know another thing that you talk about on your podcast and other podcasts as well, as procrastination. So I'll just ask one question on that for now because we're running out of time. But can you just burst the myth, easy for me to say, that procrastination is not laziness? As you mentioned, it can be an element of perfectionism, because I have had to, oh my God, I'm like habitual procrastinator, but I swear it's not lazy. It is that fear of, oh my God, if I try to do it and I screw up, then it's going to be worse. So I don't want to screw up right now, so I'll put it off. But so just burst that myth for anyone who's listening, and I'll show this to my friends and family.
There's people where it is laziness for them, but I think like anyone who can resonate, I think with this conversation, if you're listening to this kind of podcast and you're like, I don't know, an hour into it, you're not a lazy person, and you are someone who wants to improve yourself. And it's so important. We know we're not fixing ourselves, and we're just doing this because we want to, not because we have to. But that when it comes to this question of procrastination, particularly leaving things to the last minute, that's how it often manifests, as I've mentioned. But when we're doing that, it's just because it feels vulnerable to put in a full effort and to find out that maybe our full effort wasn't good enough, especially if, and I don't know if Neil, you can relate to this, but being praised for your potential, particularly in school, this happens because you don't yet have to do anything with it because you're learning. So it's like, oh my goodness, there's so much potential, you're so intelligent, all this kind of stuff. And then we go into this protecting our potential mode instead of pursuing it, because we have a self-image and identity around being someone who's smart and being someone with potential. And we don't want to do anything that might disrupt that, because it would be very painful and shameful.
Oh my God, yes.
We're thinking about it in that perfectionist way. So then what happens is that this procrastination problem. And I think I could obviously go into this a lot, but there's so much procrastination advice out there that really isn't helpful. And it sounds good. It's block the internet and delete the Instagram app and all that kind of thing, which actually just perpetuates a self-image that we are a procrastinator with a procrastination problem. Because if you weren't a procrastinator, you wouldn't need to delete the app. You wouldn't need to block the internet, because you just know how to do what needs to be done. So I don't agree with that advice. I think that it can create temporary results, but oftentimes when people do that, they find after a few days of willing themselves not to procrastinate, they're right back into it. And it's because that advice that doesn't work for perfectionists has just reinforced this self-image that you're a procrastinator. So in PGSD, my program, we work on self-image and that kind of thing as well. And it's so important for procrastination to recognize that you aren't someone who always procrastinates. We tend to just I have this I'm the world's best procrastinator, all this kind of stuff. And it's actually there's a lot of things you don't procrastinate on that we completely ignore when we're in that mindset. And also just recognizing that it feels scary to give it a full effort. And so we wait for perfect circumstances. We wait to be perfectly motivated. And as I mentioned, a lot of times we're also avoiding success. We are capable, we are able to do things, and it feels vulnerable that we might succeed more than those around us, or that we might succeed and not be able to maintain it. So we kind of just hold ourselves back because it feels well, I don't know what life would be like if I was actually successful. And also particularly with procrastination, most people are procrastinators. And so it's this bonding thing of well, yeah, I procrastinate too. And so it's kind of weird, to be no, I don't procrastinate. I just do things that need to be done when they need to be done. And it's when everyone's getting to bond over their procrastination issues and being disorganized, you're oh no, I actually just do the thing. And not in this over-prepared way coming from insecurity, but no, I just manage my mind around it, and this thing needs to be done and I just get it done. we're disconnected from the rest of the tribe, so to speak, when we're doing that. So there's lots of psychological reasons for why we procrastinate. And for anyone listening to this podcast, I can bet it's not anything to do with laziness. It's really to do with it feeling vulnerable to put in a full effort or to think about wasting effort. And so we then just, and also a whole other thing is like this addiction to feeling behind. That we get so comfortable feeling overwhelmed. Like I talk about overwhelm as being the emotional home for a perfectionist, and being behind, and that like a lot of people experience this where life feels, when it feels too good to be true, there's this fear of the other shoe dropping. Brene Brown calls it foreboding joy, that it's this feeling of like, you know, if every area of my life's going well, like someone's going to, you know, be in a car crash, or like it's this like terrifying feeling as a human, like things are so good, so now something bad's going to happen. And a lot of us have been like taught that in different ways of like, you know, if it's too good to be true, it probably is, and like, you know, bad things coming through, like all these kinds of things that just are not helpful at all. But because of that, we end up with this like addiction to feeling behind, which is why we put so much on our plates and all of that kind of thing, that it feels comfortable to be behind and to be struggling, and like more comfortable than it does to be succeeding, and all of that kind of thing. So there's just a lot that goes into it. And it's really recognizing like the theme of this, I guess, is like your motivation problem is actually just perfectionism. And that's not a problem. It's really like, I like to talk about your follow through problem is just a planning problem, and you're just not following advice that actually works for a perfectionist. And that relates back to procrastination as well. That when you are actually planning properly, that it's not about like, zero procrastination is not the goal. So it's not about like, you should never procrastinate again, but it's actually being able to understand how your brain works, how you work, and like noticing procrastination, because this is a whole other thing. Productive procrastination is a big thing perfectionists do. So like procrastinating, I mentioned procrastinating. Like we like feeling productive. So it could look like, you know, Netflix or whatever. It tends to more so be like working on the things that aren't that important, but they still need to be done, instead of doing the actual needle movers. So yeah, I obviously have a lot to say about procrastination, but I hope that has been helpful.
So please tell our audience about your podcast and where they can find it, and where they can find you and your website and all that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. So the best place to find me would be the podcast. If you're listening to this and you are a podcast listener, it's called the Perfectionism Project. So you can just search for that wherever you're listening and it'll pop up. And I recommend, I just want to say this, start with the recent episodes. Perfectionists like, I need to do it from scratch, and like go back to the beginning. And I just want to encourage everyone to instead listen from the more recent ones. You can go back at some point if you want to, but just, you know, see a title that jumps out at you and start listening just on the go. You don't have to take notes or like study it. Just like trust you'll get what you need to get. On Instagram, I'm at Perfectionism Project. And if you want to find out more,
Instagram, guys.
Thank you. And if people want to find out more about my program and become a client, samlaurabrown.com/PGSD, we'll link it up in the show notes, I'm sure, is where they can find out more about that and when we next open. And as I mentioned, I help perfectionist entrepreneurs get out of their own way. So any kind of business, if you're an artist, a writer, if you have an e-commerce business, you're a coach like me, I can help you get out of your own way.
Sam, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for doing this. Yeah.
Yes, I'd love to do that too.
All right.
Okay, kiddo. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and a huge thank you to Sam Laura Brown for joining us today. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at all the links listed in the description. And don't forget to hit like on this video and subscribe to this channel so you never miss an episode. Thank you, everyone, once again, and we will see you right here next week at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Have a nice day.